You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Mason Pashia. I'm grateful that in my role, I get to ask a lot of questions, and frequently these questions lead to more questions rather than answers. This has never felt more true than at this present moment, where the web of complexity and interdependence seems more incandescent and fragile than ever. Recently, I heard Ezra Klein say that the opposite of doom is not hope, it is curiosity and beauty. This is a posture that I hope to take today, despite this conversation having sweeping and often frightening themes. For those who regularly tune into this podcast, you know I typically cover things like sustainability and regenerative systems, and that will certainly be woven through our conversation today. After all, if we live on a finite planet, and we do, and also live in an economy built on infinite growth, and we do, then to put it lightly, the math doesn't really math in the long term. In college, I remember a professor of mine sharing with us that the origin of the word for apocalypse is to reveal. And recently, I encountered a new manifesto from Will Richardson, co-founder of the Big Questions Institute, and I wanted to unpack it on this podcast because it speaks to this. In the manifesto, Will quotes Daniel Schmachberger of the Consilience Project, saying, "The vast majority of the most consequential and difficult problems we face, climate change, nuclear war, species extinction, are the unintended outcomes of humans attempting to solve other problems. For many of our greatest problems, at some point in the past, we designed technical solutions to address them. And in the time since, the solutions have had other effects that we either did not predict or did not mitigate sufficiently in advance. The problems the world faces today are not caused by our inability to achieve our goals. They are a direct result of our success. They are a result of how destructive we are in the pursuit of our goals." It's this complexity that I want to address today, one that has many parallels in our education and learning systems. It's near the beginning of the year, the beginning of a new administration, the beginning of a boom in technology, and many of us are in pursuit of a new answer to the question, what is schooling for now? Today, as I said earlier, I'm joined by Will Richardson, former public educator and thought leader on social systems, complexity, and their impact on education. Will, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Mason. Really appreciate being here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Just do a little definition of how you think of the term schooling to start us off.
Well, I think schooling is made up of the kind of the systems, the structures, the practices, the pedagogies that we think are the best foundation of a process of giving that we have in front of us the information and the knowledge and the skills and literacies that they need in order to be successful, quote unquote, in the world in which they're living. That kind of definition has been in place now for quite a long time of just the narrative of what it means to go to school. I think it's very deeply ingrained in our society, and it's very difficult to shift.
Very much so. Yeah. I heard a podcast recently where they were talking about fermentation cultures of all things. And they were talking about the definition of the word culture being information that is passed down outside of DNA. And I that's really a kind of beautiful way to think about in schooling as well. Do you have a memory from your youth of powerful learning, or in this instance, schooling?
Well, sure. It's connected to schooling as much as it is to just real life, right? I think,
that's a theme on this podcast.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a little depressing in modeling, but I think, the moment that I characterize as the most powerful learning moment I had when I was, while growing up or an early young adult, was when my mom died suddenly when I was 23 years old. And she was a single parent, she was all I knew in terms of family. And got over the very powerful grief moment around that, all of a sudden I had to grow up and I had to kind of take on all of these things that I prepared for, I hadn't been prepared for. And I don't think anything can prepare you for it, but it's a powerful learning moment. I had to learn about myself. I had to learn about living as an adult, living on my own, things that adults do. And also learning a lot about just grieving and going through that is really difficult. I remember I was working as a reporter for a small paper here locally at the time, and I wrote a series just on what happens after death, about the paperwork stuff, that you have to go through. But a lot of it was just about the process, and it was cathartic for me. I'm not sure how many people read it, and that's when I think a moment where I was like, oh, so this is what it means to kind of be responsible for yourself and take on all of these things that are happening in not just my world, but in the world, kind of larger, and try to make sense of them. And again, it speaks to how we learn in just about every way possible.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I know you engage a lot with questions of complexity, and that certainly is a moment of complexity in your life when you realize all the things you don't know and have to do something like grief. But do you know when you were equipped with the language to talk about complexity, or when you started to view things and actually use that kind of framing?
Yeah, I'm not sure I still am, right? I understand what complexity is. The world gets more complex.
Yeah, right.
And so I don't know that there's a moment or, there's something that happens that exactly turns that light bulb on and says, oh, so this is what it means. I think it's just living in the world. And again, just being a part of, what happens, not just in your own life, but what's happening in other people's lives, or the challenges and the opportunities that are going on, the new technologies. I mean, we could make a list, right, of all the different things that are constantly evolving, constantly changing. Just trying to figure out, well, what do those things mean, right? What is? It's not just making sense of what's happening, but it's also trying to capture what's emerging, and what is it that is going to be the best move next, right? And 5 years down the road or 10 years
Yeah.
down the road. And I think that especially is becoming more complex. It's becoming much more difficult to figure out, well, what's 2030 going to look like? What's 2050 going to look like if we have a 2050? That change has always happened, right?
Yep.
And if you talk to our parents and grandparents, they'll tell you that change is really fast. But I don't think it's the same. I really don't. I think these are existential, just very fast moving, mind boggling in many ways, things that are happening that hardly anyone can make sense of right now.
Yeah, I certainly feel boggled or baffled daily. So I definitely get you there. You recently put out this manifesto, and it really frames the conversation around confronting collapse. And I know you put a lot of thought into both of those words. So could you give like a little bit of just context on either what it means to confront collapse or why those words specifically were chosen?
Well, it's hard, right? If you take collapse at a meta level, it's really hard because it suggests that life as we know it on the planet can't continue and will end. There's a great quote by Dougal Hine where he says, it's not the end of the world, full stop. It's the end of the world as we know it, right? So it's not like collapse means the world's going away. The earth is going to survive us no matter what, but
Right.
it is the end of the world as we know it. And I really have come to that belief. And on one hand, that's heavy, no doubt. But on another level, it's kind of freeing because it's like, okay, so what's the work in front of me now?
Yeah.
What's the work in front of us? I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to fix all of these problems that we have, but ultimately, those well-meaning people are not fixing the core problem that we have. And that is that we are out of relation with one another and we're out of relation with every other living thing on the planet. And as much as we might be able to find some technological fix for climate change or, whatever, until we repair those relationships, collapse is still in the offing, I think. And it goes back to what you said in the introduction, too. We live on a finite planet, and yet we have this narrative of growth that is infinite. Those two things don't work. That math doesn't add up, right?
Right.
So it's a posture that moves you away from, oh, we need to fix everything, to how do we navigate this? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we best care for one another, for our children, for, again, all other life on the planet, and really focus on repairing as much as we can and regenerating those types of relationships that are absolutely necessary for life to continue on the planet.
I was reading a poem this week by a poet named Carl Phillips, and the poem was titled Regime, but the end of it really speaks to this kind of sad comfort that you found there, where he says, it's hard to believe in them, the beautiful colors of extinction, but these are the colors, which I think is partially just like gorgeous, but also
Yeah.
the beautiful colors of extinction. Like that really does feel what it means to have a really like a lovely or aware moment in this moment. Like
Yeah.
there's a context to it there.
And I think it speaks to, I mean, Margaret Wheatley is someone who has had an influence on me, and her concept of really what it's about right now is creating islands of sanity, right? These
Mm,
places where we can come together as we go through this chaos and do things where we still remember what good humans do, where we still treat each other with kindness and with equity and justice, and that all those good parts of being a human are still possible to us.
yeah.
But the reality of it is maybe not possible at the scale we need them to be right now, just
Mm,
because of so many of the, again, the kind of tensions and narratives and systems and whatever else that make that a very heavy lift.
yeah. So let's take this directly back into the schooling lens. So I think we've got in your manifesto, you also quote Indy Johar as like outlining who's at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and a Harvard lecturer, and it frames it up nicely as we have this view of reality that's composed of divisible objects versus entangled wholes. And I think that the schooling system really leans into that, where it's like all of these kind of atomized experiences and individuals that have no real, I guess, not impact, but like significance in the real world while they're in school, and like not on each other. They're kind of kept separate. So we do a lot of work at Getting Smart talking about basically what people should know and be able to do given things that are changing and emerging. And a lot of that work results in something akin to a portrait of a graduate, right? Where you have like a district or a system defining outcomes for students. There's variation and there's some like thoughtful, more like differences among communities, but in general, they kind of hover around these four C's. It's like not, it doesn't get too far. So
Right.
in your manifesto, you talk about the IDGs 23 skills for growth, which include things that I think are related to the four C's, but maybe do gesture at this more entangled sensibility. I don't know if you know those off the top of your head or have some that you can rattle off. I have some here, but would love to just talk about some of the things that are mentioned in these IDGs to start.
Yeah, well, I think that the premise of the IDGs is that the kind of adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals was kind of not going as quickly as people had hoped, and what they realized or what they thought was that it was because we weren't ready
Hmm.
as individuals to really fully embrace
Interesting.
and articulate and put into practice at scale the types of sustainable goals that had been articulated. And there's a quote in there. I'm not sure if I can't remember if I put it in the manifesto, but they have a quote in the prelude to the Interdevelopment Goals where it says something along the lines of, "We realize that this is not a technical change; it's an adaptive change." Right, and this
Interesting.
goes
Yeah.
back to Ron Heifetz at MIT or Harvard, talking about, sure, you can bring someone in to fix your technology or to change, what your classrooms look like in a technological sense. But if you don't also change the dispositions that people have toward the technology and the ways in which they relate to the technologies, then there's not really going to be a shift in what classroom practice looks like. To use again a school example of that.
Yeah.
So I think that what the IDGs are trying to say is this is how we need to be. And they are mostly, I think they call them skills. I think most of them are just dispositions, right?
Hmm.
They're about having courage, having honesty, having empathy, but they're also about kind of skills in the context of being skilled at organizing,
Yeah.
at bringing people together. They're at being skilled at looking further into the future.
Yeah.
I do think a lot of that separation that happens in schools, like you said, separation of ages, separation of classes, separation of curriculum, all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff, separation in terms of competition, all of that. It leads to separation in, the way that we think about the world, the way we
Yeah.
think about one another. And again, the IDGs, I think, are trying at least to help us identify, at the very least, those types of things, those types of dispositions and skills, and in some case literacies that we need to have to come together more, to be more coherent in what we are hoping for, and then hopefully be able to move more effectively toward that.
Yeah. And I have a couple of them in front of me, so I'll just read a couple. They've got on these IDGs list, they have inner compass, sense making, long-term visioning, mobilization skills, humility, things that are, I think some of those do toe the line between skill and disposition,
Yeah.
but they really are like a pretty beautiful list. So definitely I'll link in the show notes. Check out that list of IDGs and maybe cross-reference it with your portrait and see what's missing and where you can really lean in terms of modeling them at the very least throughout the day and your school culture.
I think, I think I may have mentioned honesty too, and that's not
Yeah.
one of them, but I want to add that facing reality, being honest about the situation that we're in right now. Again, Vanessa Andreotti and hospicing modernity, right? Talking about acknowledging and then trying to overcome the denials that we have in terms of how we think about the world and how we see the world. If you're not starting from a place where you're looking at the world realistically and understanding what the challenges are, I think it's much harder, obviously, to move with coherence collectively, whatever, with others to get to those outcomes, those aspirations that we may all have.
I definitely agree. I have a distinct memory of I went to a rowing class one time, and I think I wrote a blog on this. And I was very struck by the fact that the progress meter was the whole class's progress and how far we've rowed. And I remember that just totally shifting my mentality as like I was going through the motions, and everyone around me the same way. It was just so powerful to see something growing and just changing because of a whole group's impact rather than
Yeah.
just the usual exercise monitor of like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm letting everybody down or not, or myself down. On that note, and what we were talking about with versus entangled and divided, how do you think you begin to shift some of these like achievement goals, performance outlooks from more of an individual aim to one that's more collective? Do you have any ideas around that? I feel like it's a tricky one to.
I think we are very incoherent in the language that we use in schools. I tell this story all the time, but I have gone into, in many cases, gone into a school, gone up to 10 different people and asked them how do they define learning. And I'll get 10 different answers. I'll ask them how they define success. And those actually are a little bit closer, but still kind of all over the map type of thing, right? And I think that in order to really begin to move into a different way of thinking about what happens in schools, I kind of use the phrase that we can build a different experience of school for kids and for teachers. I think you have to be on the same page when it comes to what you think learning is and how it happens. I talk about this a lot, but there are these kind of unspoken truths about school that we don't want to really acknowledge. And that is, in many cases, schools are built in ways that and use practices and structures that are antithetical to the way that humans learn, like totally. And again, it goes back to that idea of separation. I think the really hard part about it, or interesting part of it, is that everyone knows it, but they just don't want to talk about it. If you ask people, what do you need in order to learn? They'll list a whole bunch of things that normally don't end up in classrooms, right? So I think that's a piece of it. I also think, though, too, that we have to stop referring to nature as something out there and talking about it or learning about it out there. And first of all, acknowledge that we're all part of nature, that we are nature. We are not separate from nature. And that without all those other living things out there, we don't live on the planet. And I think the most striking thing maybe I heard in 2024 was when Casey Means was Dr. Casey Means was giving a talk or on a panel for actually a government program where she said basically that incarcerated criminals get more daylight, sun time, outside time than most kids in schools in this country on a regular basis, And so you wonder, well, why, or you don't wonder, actually, you're not surprised when we don't feel connected to nature, when we don't, or to, all those other living things that are out there. And I struggle a little bit here too, because I think every time actually we say nature, we kind of, again, separate ourselves from it, right?
Right.
It's all other living things on the planet, I think, is a better way of phrasing it, even though it's clunkier, but I think it's more meaningful. So I think, again, some shared language, some shared understanding of what the basics are, in terms of what we believe around what school should be and what the outcomes are. Shared belief around what's happening in the world right now, come to some coherence around that. And actually, too, a shared aspirational future where we can look 20, 30 years into the future and say, yeah, that's where we want to go. That's what we want. And I do think that that's easier for people 20, 30 years in the future than it is for the, 3 to 5 year strategic plan, which, is kind of,
Yeah.
unless you have a 25 or 30 or 50-year vision for where you want to go, that 3 to 5 strategic plan is kind of this way for 5 years, then this way for 5 years, then that way for 5 years. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, just coming to some shared community understanding of the role of school and what the world is demanding right now
Hmm.
of our kids, I think is the first step.
Yeah. You've also, I think you've described it as, just go back to the portrait framing it for a second, like as a portrait of an ancestor, which I'm sure has some amount of homage to Roman's Good Ancestor book and a
Absolutely.
lot of other
Yeah.
thinkers. But
Yep.
I think that's a really unique way to think about it too. That sort of implies this entanglement and also an accountability, I think, that comes along with it. That like when Portrait of a Graduate seems like world is yours and you're out there doing whatever. And Ancestor really does have this like core piece to it that I
Well,
really like.
there are two different success narratives that are embedded in those two things. Portrait of a Graduate is you're ready to go out in the world, go to college, make some money, have a good life type of thing, right? Portrait of an Ancestor is you're ready to go out in the world and be a good human. That's not to say that we don't want kids to be good humans if we have a portrait of a graduate, but portrait of an ancestor requires you to think about, well, what are the implications of what I'm doing right now on my kids, then my grandkids, or future generations down the road? How do the decisions that I make right now change the narrative or change the arc of the world moving forward, right? And if again, if we're honest about it, and if we are facing reality, we understand that we're not going to be able to make decisions based on growth and increased incomes and economic gain for very much longer at all. And that the decisions we have to make have to be for more regenerative, sustainable, longer term visions of the world or aspirations for the world that we really want to live in. So I think they're two very different
Yeah.
premises that we write those things about, right?
Well,
And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, too, that a lot of schools have the capacity to really understand what it means to be a portrait or to have a portrait of an ancestor.
totally. Well, I think that it gestures at how hard the work is and how important it is to bring in the whole community in that process. Like it's sort of the it takes a village mentality. Like it can't be the sole
Yeah.
goal of school to prepare everyone to be a good ancestor. Like that is a very collaborative and inclusive process that everyone has to be a part of and
But
buy into.
what's really interesting, though, we've gone to schools and we have this other document ebook called the 12 Big Questions, right? And the first question in there is what is sacred? And we've
Hmm.
gone to schools and brought together parents and community members, kids, teachers, and the interesting thing, though not surprising, all of them say the same thing about what is sacred, and that is relationships, community, mental health, right? None of them say college diplomas, good
Right.
grades. You know what I'm saying, right? So
Yeah.
I think regardless even of, how fraught the political scene is right now in the United States and elsewhere, I do think there are still core agreements that
Yeah.
we have about what we want our world to be and what we want for our children. And I think it's a great starting point, right? That we can agree here. Okay, so if those are the things, then what do we need to do in order to be good ancestors and perpetuate those things that are really important, those relationships, the health, the communities that we live in, right?
Yeah, I think we've covered a number of either schools or like advisory programs like Crew that I think do a really good job at trying to keep some of those things sacred and preserve them throughout the day and make them visible rather than just sort of like an invisible sacred, which it still has value, but perhaps it's less actionable in a moment. But yeah, there's a ton there. And to return to this question of what is schooling for now in this moment, I know we started with this kind of collapse narrative, and I'm just curious if you have either a belief or a theory about like how do you bring that up to kids? Like we're how do you talk about a world that is on a path and really bring it up without making it feel like that is both permanent and just like terrifying in some ways?
Well, I think it's a question that we need to be asking a lot more than we are right now.
Yep.
In the manifesto, when I got to the final or the next to last belief in there, I said the purpose of schooling now is to help kids navigate what's coming, both in emotionally, physically, spiritually. That is the work of schools, to prepare them with the dispositions that they need, the skills that they need to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also think, though, by not talking to kids about this in age-appropriate ways, and I think we can do that, we can figure out how to do that. But by not talking about that, to be honest with you, I think we're lying to them. We're lying to our communities. We're just not being honest with them.
Mm.
And, kids know this stuff. I mean, they're not
Right.
immune to what's happening in the world. They're getting news. They see things that are going on. And I think for many kids, it's kind of like, why aren't you talking to us about this? So I just want to tell you a quick story. So
Love it.
because it happened on Tuesday. We're running this workshop, this Confronting education workshop, starting in a couple of weeks. And I've invited some students to come in and be a part of this group of 50 people. And so there was a woman who started a school in Bangalore, and one of her students came in, and she was talking, the student was a year 10 student. She was just talking about how that school approaches your question, right?
Yeah.
And what they're honest. And look, when you're in Bangalore, collapse is outside your front window, right?
Yeah.
You're in the middle of a drought, you're in the middle of a flood, you're breathing air that is, toxic. And so there's, you're not escaping it. It's not to say it's all happening there, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, of course.
And she said, it's heavy. Year 10, this girl said, it's really heavy and it is hard and it is depressing. But my school lets me work on those problems, right? So they call it a problem to project pedagogy, right? So they talk about these things, and then kids tap into different parts of it that they find interesting or relevant to their own lives. And then they pursue those things and they learn about those things and they talk about solutions to those things. So it's like they are empowered by the fact that A, they're being told the truth, and B, they're giving space and agency to actually work on those things in their own lives, right? In the context of this school experience that this particular person has created for them. And it was amazing. I felt joy after listening to her. I really did. I was like, thank goodness, somebody's actually going there with kids. And what's happening is kids are stepping up. I understand why we fear it. I understand that we want to hold our children, but I don't think that that's preparing them for the world that they're going to exist in. And I don't think it's even arguable anymore that the world that they're going to live in is going to be even more complex and more chaotic than the one we're living in right now. And if we're not talking with them about that, and if we're not preparing them for that, then we are doing this. We are going, good luck. Good luck. All right. Hope that works out for you. Right. And that's just unconscionable almost. Right. So I think, it can be done, but I think we have to learn those skills. As adults, we have to learn those skills. As adults, we have to first acknowledge, and again, stop denying the fact that the world is in some dire straits right now. I think we have to own it for ourselves, right? But I also think that one of the reasons we need to do that is so that we can help our kids through this.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much there. I just want to highlight one word you said which is care. And I think we also just, the nuance in that word, like care is not just positive things all the time. Like I think that it even touches back to what you were talking about earlier with grief. It's like, grief is care. Like there's so many of these negative, in quotes for those who aren't watching, emotions that I think are so important to both share and understand how to share them with others that right now we just kind of push under a rug. So
I agree.
So sharing is caring again, in this instance. Sharing about collapse is caring. So I want to just go to ask another question. You're talking about these strategic plans, and I know that you do some of this work where you're helping folks through strategic plans, and you're talking about sort of the challenges of a 3 to 5. So 3 to 5 year one. When you're doing this work, do you have like a big picture vision day first where you're like, okay, let's project out? And what are some things that you say to folks to kind of get them with that, like either futures thinking mindset or really like that expanded horizon view?
Well, I think, again, here's another challenge, right? And that is it's really hard for us to imagine 25, 30, 50 years out.
Right.
And part of that is because, again, the world is changing as quickly as it is. But the other part of it is that we don't do this work. We
Right.
don't flex our imagination muscles hardly ever, especially in schools and especially in thinking about the futures that we want. So part of it is to try to develop some regular practice around imagining, and there's different ways that you can do that. Obviously, Rob Hopkins, who wrote a book it's titled From What Is to What If,
Hmm.
which is a great book on imagining, and he shares a lot of his practice, but some of it is to simply take imaginative trips into the future, and to close your eyes and you're on a time machine and all of a sudden you open up and it's 2050. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear?
Right.
How has the world changed? So there's that. There's things like design fiction where maybe during that trip you ask people to bring back an artifact from the future and
Right.
then like talk about it. Like the one great example that I've seen, there's many, but one of them is called Cricket Crunch, right, which
Mm.
is this cereal from the future that's based on crickets because we've run you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But it's great, right? So you kind of sit there and go, well, how do we get to that, and to kind of unpack that. So it is a process of trying to develop that mindset, develop that skill of imagination. It's a process of bringing together disparate groups from within the school community to have, we've called them dream summits.
Hmm.
Like what is it that 30 years down the road you hope this place looks like, and what is it, again, what's sacred, what have you kept from the current moment, but maybe what have you not kept, what have you, and kind of the term these days, what have you hospiced and moved away, and what might be new in the things that you're doing. It's hard for people to think about that. I think, again, the school narrative that we have right now is so deeply ingrained that to really think of something different, especially for a school that's an established school and been around for a long time, it's very difficult to do that. But the key is it's not a one-off. It can't be a one-off, right? And I think, again, too many schools say, "Oh yeah, we did that. We
Yeah.
checked the box. We imagined." It's like, it's not really the point, right? We've tried to create what we've called kind of these futures committees, that would meet on a regular basis, that would read about change in the world.
Yeah.
It's hard, I mean, it's hard for people to commit to that.
It
But
is.
I do think that that's where we have to start. And again, our own imaginations too, right? I wrote on LinkedIn early in the year that one of my goals this year was to just spend time imagining, what I want my future to be, what I want my kids' future to be, what I want the world's future to be. It's hard.
It is. And oftentimes I know that this was, I think, kind of the impetus for your manifesto too, is it's like you have to sit down and actually put words to it, because if you're just kind of making the space and feeling it out, it's really hard to ever grasp something tangible and organize your thoughts in a way that's like, no, this is the thing that I'm imagining.
And I mean, it just helped me clarify what I believe.
For sure.
I mean, when
Yep.
you're reading about this and thinking about this, there's just so many things that are kind of, bouncing off each other in your brain. But I do suggest in the book that schools should have that conversation. What do you believe about the world? What do you
Mhm.
believe about education? What do you believe about the future?
Yeah.
Because unless you've, unless you've clarified that, again, it's hard to be coherent in the ways in which you move forward towards some established vision or goal.
First of all, thank you so much for joining us today, Will. Really lovely conversation. One thing that really sticks with me, partially just because of the work we do, but I love this idea of portrait of an ancestor. I think it'd be a really valuable exercise for school leaders to look at their portrait of a graduate through the lens of a portrait of ancestor and say, like, are those linked or are they not? And how can we really start to fill in some of that scaffolding or the gaps, or bring in the community to talk about these things? I also just love the generosity with which you share the people who are shaping your thinking from the manifesto. So that's just like this getting smart tenet of learning out loud. You're just kind of like, oh, these people. So I'll be sure to copy all the folks from your footnotes as well as the link to your manifesto, but put them in the show notes because there's a bunch of real gems in there as far as thinkers and people who will kind of reframe the world for you. And I think there's also just this sort of belief in the value of people and learning that you have that I just really find full and encouraging. And I think that holding that as like kind of a candle in this darkness of potential other ends is really a generative place to start from. So I really appreciate all that. Check out the manifesto for sure. I'm going to end with reading. You alluded to this, but to answer our question for today, which is what is schooling for now? This is a quick little paragraph from your manifesto. So, and you already said some of this, but an education must now center on preparing our children and ourselves emotionally, physically, and spiritually to navigate complexity, chaos, and collapse, and to place a deep emphasis on repairing our relationships with one another and with all living things on the planet. Will, thanks so much for joining today.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.